The bidding hadn't even reached $1,000 when Nora Ashfield walked through the side door of the Kelowna Livestock and Equipment Centre, and the room changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the way a room changes when someone walks in who doesn't belong. The slight pause in the auctioneer's rhythm, the heads turning one by one, the low murmur that moves through a crowd like a current. She was 26 years old, wearing a grey fleece with the hood down, jeans and boots that weren't tactical enough to belong to anyone in that building. She carried a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and a folded piece of paper in her left hand, and she stood at the edge of the concrete floor like she was trying to find her bearings in a place she had studied on a map but never actually been. Nobody offered to help her. Nobody moved toward her. The Kelowna facility wasn't the kind of place that appeared on the tourist side of the Okanagan Valley. It sat off Highway 97, past the orchards and the vineyard signs, behind a chain-link fence topped with rusted wire that nobody had maintained since at least 2019. The main building smelled like motor oil and sawdust, and something animal underneath all of it. On a normal Thursday, it might have been selling farm equipment or seized vehicles. Today's inventory was different. Today was a military working dog dispersal auction. The handlers stood in clusters near the far wall, each one holding the lead of an animal that had cost the Canadian Armed Forces somewhere between $40,000 and $80,000 to train. Belgian Malinois, mostly. 2 German Shepherds, 1 Labrador who had already been claimed by a veteran assistance program and was simply waiting out the morning beside his new intake coordinator with the patience of a dog who understood that waiting was part of the work. The others were not as settled. They stood or paced or fixed their attention on the room's exits with the kind of focused alertness that doesn't switch off because someone decided you were retired. Nora Ashfield looked at all of them. Then she looked at the auctioneer's clipboard on the folding table near the entrance and ran her finger down the lot numbers until she found what she was looking for. Lot 9. Call sign. Ranger. She found him in the second pen from the left. He wasn't pacing. That was the first thing she noticed. Every other dog in the building was in motion, restless, scanning, burning off energy that had nowhere useful to go. Ranger was sitting, completely still. His amber eyes tracked every person who moved within 20 feet of his pen, and his ears moved independently, rotating like radar dishes catching signals from different directions, but the rest of him didn't move at all. He was a Belgian Malinois, dark-faced, with a coat that had gone slightly rough along the spine. Not from neglect, the discharge note said, but from stress. He had a scar along his left jawline that had healed white against the darker fur, and his left rear leg had a slight irregularity when he shifted his weight, a ghost of an injury that the veterinary report described as fully healed, but that Nora had looked at long enough to understand, was still present in some way that didn't show up on imaging. He had been decorated twice. His handler had been decorated 4 times. His handler had been Nora's father. Master Corporal David Ashfield had died 14 months ago in Latvia during a NATO training exercise that went wrong in a way that the official report described carefully, and that Nora had read 17 times trying to find the sentence that explained it in a way she could accept. She had not found that sentence. What she had found, 6 weeks after the funeral, was a letter from the Canadian Forces Base Animal Care Unit, informing her that Ranger had been officially retired from service following his handler's death and would be entered into the military working dog disposal program within 90 days, unless a suitable placement was identified. She had tried the suitable placement route. She had called the number on the letter. She had been transferred 4 times and had finally reached a logistics coordinator who explained with genuine regret that non-military family members were not eligible to adopt former military working dogs through the standard program, that the liability protocols were extensive, and that the animal in question had displayed significant behavioral changes since losing his handler that made civilian placement a matter requiring careful evaluation. Careful evaluation. 14 months of it, she had filed 2 formal requests. She had written to her MP. She had connected with a veterans advocacy group in Ottawa that had been lobbying for reformed MWD retirement policy for 3 years. She had done everything that a person with a folded piece of paper and a canvas tote bag and no military rank to her name could do. And then she had driven 4 hours from Vancouver to stand in a livestock centre in Kelowna and spend the money her father had left her. She didn't know if it would be enough. The bidding on Lot 9 opened at $800. The auctioneer, a compact man named Terry, who had been running these dispersal sales for 11 years, and had the brisk, slightly apologetic manner of someone who understood what he was selling, wasn't quite the same as a tractor, announced the starting price without ceremony and looked around the room. 3 hands went up. Nora felt her stomach tighten. She had $4,200 in her account, the full amount from the TFSA her father had kept in her name since she was 19, the one he'd added to every year and told her was for emergencies or opportunity, whichever came first. She had not expected competition. The advocacy group had told her that dispersal auctions for high-drive dogs with behavioral flags were usually quiet. Nobody wanted a dog that had tried to bite 2 of the last 3 people who'd approached his pen. The man in the second row raised his paddle to $1,400. He had a logo on his jacket, a private security company, one of the larger ones that contracted to resource extraction sites in northern BC. Nora had seen the jacket when she came in. She had tried not to look at it. $1,500, said someone near the back. $16, said the security company man. Nora raised her hand. $1,800. Several heads turned. Terry looked at her over his clipboard with the neutral expression of a man who had learned not to make assumptions at these sales. $1,800 from the young lady at the side. Do I hear 19? The security company man looked at her. He had the kind of assessment in his gaze that Nora had grown up watching men direct at her father when he walked into rooms. The quick calculation, the adjustment. He raised his paddle. 2,000. Nora raised hers. 22. Ranger had not moved during any of this. He was still sitting in exactly the same position, ears rotating, amber eyes moving from face to face with a methodical precision that Nora recognized because her father had described it to her twice on the phone from Shiloh. He reads the room before I do, David Ashfield had said. I just follow his lead about who to trust. 2,400, said the security company man. 26, said Nora. There was a pause. The third bidder had dropped out at 1,900. The room was quieter now in the specific way rooms get when something is becoming more than just a transaction. 28, said the man with the jacket. Nora looked at her folded paper. She had written the number on it that morning before she left Vancouver, in her own handwriting, so she would have to look at it if she was tempted to go past it. 4,200. The whole amount. She had a $700 buffer between the number she'd written and the full balance of her account, and she had a tank of gas to get home on, and that was it. 3,000, she said. There was a murmur in the room that Nora couldn't fully interpret. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. 3,000 from the side. Do I hear 32? The security company man looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Something shifted in his expression. He didn't raise his paddle, going once at 3,000. Going twice. Terry paused, looked around the room with the careful professionalism of a man who always gives the room a real chance. Sold to the young lady at the side. Nora released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her hand was shaking slightly. She pressed it flat against her leg. What happened next was not something she had planned for, because she hadn't let herself think past the bidding. She had focused on the number and the paddle, and the moment the gavel came down, and she had not allowed herself to consider what came after that, because considering it would have required her to sit with the possibility that it wouldn't happen, and she had been sitting with that possibility for 14 months, and she was finished with it. What came after was that she had to go get him. A handler named Curtis, young, professional, clearly experienced with difficult animals, brought Ranger out of the pen on a lead and a catch pole together, and explained in a low voice that the dog had shown unpredictable reactivity with strangers, that they'd need to do the transfer in stages, that she would need to keep her distance for the first. Nora wasn't listening in the way Curtis meant her to listen. She was watching Ranger. He had stopped the moment they came through the pen door. Not frozen. That was the wrong word. Stopped, the way a dog stops when it has detected something it is trying to classify. His nose was working, barely visibly, just the faintest movement of the muscles around his nostrils. His ears had shifted from their scanning rotation to something more focused, both of them angled forward and slightly down, toward her. "Ma'am," Curtis said, and Nora heard the warning in it. She wasn't moving toward Ranger. She was just standing still, 3 meters away, with her hands loose at her sides, and she said the only thing she had come here to say. She said her father's name, not loudly, not in a commanding voice. She said it the way you'd say it if you were calling him for dinner, or telling someone a story that started with him. David Ashfield, 2 words. The whole of him, the way he had signed his letters, and the way the chaplain had read it at the service, and the way it appeared on the documentation she had carried from Vancouver in her canvas bag. Ranger sat down, not slowly, not with the gradual settling of a dog being commanded to sit. He sat down the way a dog sits when something has resolved itself, abrupt, clean, certain. His head came up. His amber eyes found her face, and he made a sound that Nora had not expected, and that she would spend a long time afterward failing to adequately describe to people who asked her about it. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a whine. It was something lower and more sustained, something that seemed to come from further back in his chest, and it lasted only a few seconds, and Curtis had gone completely still beside her, and somewhere in the room behind her, a woman said something quietly to the person next to her, and the whole building felt like it had shifted a half-degree on its foundation. Nora crouched down. Not all the way. She'd read enough to know you didn't rush that. She crouched to his level and kept her hands visible, and she waited. Ranger stood up from his sit and walked toward her. The catch pole went slack in Curtis's hand. The lead kept pace, but Curtis wasn't guiding it. He was just holding it, watching with the expression of someone who has been working with these animals for years and has learned not to be surprised by them, and is being surprised by one anyway. The dog walked until he was close enough that Nora could see the texture of the scar along his jaw and the slight clouding at the edge of his left eye that the vet report had mentioned. Stress-related, non-progressive, and then he stopped. He lowered his head. He pressed his nose very gently against the back of her right hand. Nora didn't say anything for a moment. She let him take the time he needed. Then she said quietly, "I know, buddy." Her voice didn't hold. That was fine. Nobody in the building was looking anywhere else. There was paperwork, of course. There is always paperwork. The Kelowna facility had 4 forms that needed to be completed before any animal could leave the premises, and one of them required a veterinary attestation that Curtis had to go to a back office to print, and while they were waiting, Terry the auctioneer brought Nora a paper cup of coffee from the machine in the hall and set it on the table next to her without saying anything, which she thought was probably the kindest thing anyone had done for her all year. Ranger sat next to her chair. He had allowed Curtis to remove the catch pole with no issue. He was on a standard lead now, which Nora held with her left hand and which she was trying not to grip too tightly. Beneath the table, his weight shifted once and then settled against her ankle. And she looked down at him, and he looked up at her with those amber eyes, and she thought about her father saying, "He reads the room before I do." And she thought that maybe that was true, that maybe Ranger had been reading rooms and taking inventory and waiting 14 months for a reading that made sense to him. The man from the security company passed the table on his way out. He paused. He looked at the dog, and then at Nora, and he said, "He served with a good team. I hope he gets a good retirement." Nora looked up at him. "He will," she said. The man nodded once and left, and Nora turned back to the paperwork. The advocacy group had given her a contact at a MWD transition program in Abbotsford, a woman named Dr. Patricia Kwan, who had been working with former military dogs for 9 years, and who had agreed 3 weeks ago to do a full behavioral assessment on Ranger and provide the support documentation that would help Nora navigate the liability requirements for civilian ownership. Nora had the appointment in her phone. She had also, in a moment of exhausted realism at 2 in the morning a week earlier, booked a follow-up appointment 2 weeks after that, because she had learned in the past 14 months to assume that things would take longer than planned and to plan accordingly. She thought her father would have approved of that. The drive back to Vancouver was 4 hours. Nora had mapped out 3 rest stops and marked the ones with grassy areas behind the facilities. She had a travel bowl and a water bottle in the canvas bag. She had a dog bed in the back seat, borrowed from her neighbor's golden retriever, which was slightly too large but would do. Ranger spent the first 40 minutes of the drive sitting upright in the back seat, watching through the rear window with that systematic alertness, cataloguing the vehicles behind them at regular intervals the way he had been trained to do. Nora watched him in the mirror, somewhere past Merritt, on the long stretch where the highway drops through the canyon and the light comes down at a slant through the ponderosa pine. He lay down. Not all the way. His head stayed up for another 10 minutes, still watching, but his body relaxed against the borrowed bed and his breathing slowed from the quick, high-chested rhythm of an animal on duty to something longer, deeper. Nora kept her eyes on the road. She reached back once, briefly, without looking, and put her hand on the top of his head, and he exhaled against the seat cushion with the sound of something finally, after a long time, setting down a weight. She thought about her father. She thought about him the way she had learned to think about him over 14 months. Not as an absence, not as the void where a person used to be, but as something more like a direction, a heading you could orient yourself toward even when you couldn't see it. He had spent 6 years working beside this animal, 6 years of early mornings and field deployments, and the 1,000 small moments that build a trust that outlasts everything official, that doesn't end when someone signs a retirement form or closes a file. The animal had remembered, in a room full of strangers, in a building that smelled like motor oil and commerce, and the particular institutional exhaustion of things being processed. He had heard a name, and he had known what it meant. That was the whole story, really. Everything else was just the road that led to it. The sun was already past the mountains by the time Nora got on the Trans-Canada heading west, and the sky over the Fraser Valley was going pink and orange in the way it does in October, layered and slow, the kind of ice that makes the valley look larger than it is. She turned the radio on low. She drove with one hand on the wheel. In the back seat, Ranger slept. He slept the entire way into Vancouver, through the tunnel, and through the city traffic, and through the neighborhood streets where Nora had grown up, past the corner store where her father used to buy the newspaper on Saturday mornings, past the park where she had learned to ride a bike, while David Ashfield jogged alongside her with his hand on the seat, past the house with the blue door that had been his, that was hers now, that had been waiting. She pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. Then she got out and opened the rear door and unclipped the lead and stood back. Ranger stepped out of the car. He put his nose down and moved in a slow arc across the driveway, reading the ground, cataloguing. He moved to the base of the front steps and paused. He lifted his head, and for a moment he was perfectly still. The way he'd been still in his pen, not frozen, but present, fully present, every sense attending to something Nora couldn't access. She didn't know what he was looking for. She thought maybe he didn't either, exactly, but she thought he found something in it. something in the air, or the stone of the steps, or some arrangement of things that lined up in a way that made sense to him. Because after a moment, he turned and walked up the steps and sat down in front of the door and looked back at her over his shoulder, waiting. Nora picked up the canvas bag from the car and walked up the steps and put her key in the lock, and Raindren stood and moved inside ahead of her, moving through each room with the systematic thoroughness of an animal, securing a perimeter, checking angles and corners, and the spaces behind doors. And when he had finished, he came back to where she was standing in the hallway, and he sat down at her left side, exactly where he would have been trained to be, and he looked up at her and did not look away. She reached down and put her hand on the top of his head. "Welcome home," she said. He leaned into her hand just slightly, and the house, which had been too quiet for 14 months, was quiet in a different way now, the way a house is quiet when it has someone in it, when the silence is the silence of rest and not of absence, when the space between one moment and the next is not empty, but held the way a dog holds a watch in the small hours of the night, patient and certain, and entirely, unwaveringly there.